it's all poetry. And by poetry, I don't simply mean a poem. I like reading poems. I know Dr. Coltlaser loves to read poems because they can put you in touch with the poetry of life. Now, unfortunately, many of us were first introduced to poetry back when we were juniors and seniors in high school. And in all likelihood, the teacher never really helped us connect the poetry to the poetry of life, which is why many people never read another poem after high school graduation. Yet whether we know it or not, our souls are starved for poetry and the energy it can bring to us. Because poetry is feeling. Poetry is beauty. Poetry is depth of experience. And to be in touch with the poetry of life is to be in touch with feeling and beauty and depth of experience. And when you think about that, that is the essence of the spiritual journey. Now, I'm not sure if Jesus ever wrote a poem. And it doesn't really matter. What I know is that Jesus was in touch with the poetry of life. And like a poet, he often turned to the power of language to break open the presence of God. And so far as I know, Jesus never used any philosophical language to talk about God. He didn't say things like Aristotle that God is the great unmoved mover. No. Instead, like a poet, Jesus said things like this: being aware of God is like going to the best wedding reception you've ever attended in your entire life. And there's singing and dancing and lots of delicious food. In other words, God is a party. Now, you wouldn't know that by attending most churches, but that's the kind of language Jesus used. Or he said things like, God is a woman who has lost a coin and sweeps her house all day long and night looking for it because it has so much value. Or he said things like, God is a powerful, inspiring, spiritual energy. And if you're really in touch with it, you can move a mountain in your life. Jesus would use language, particularly the language of image, which is so much a part of poetry, to help people discover the divine presence. And that's why today we are using in our service what is, interestingly enough, the most popular poet in America today. A 13th century poet named Rumi. Rumi was a poet, a theologian, and a religious mystic. His use of language transcends any particular religion, yet is profoundly spiritual. And like Jesus, he often uses surprising, shocking, ordinary, beautiful, humorous images to create depth and feeling and insight for his readers. And by the way, Rumi wrote a lot of poems. But what we're offering you today are a few little morsels from the enormous feast that was Rumi's creative life. And we've selected two categories of Rumi poems for you today. The first are poems of waking up. And that comes out of the conviction that the most important thing we can ever do in life is to wake up. To be awake, fully awake, means we are in touch with ourselves, with our neighbors, and with God. To be awake, fully awake, means that we think and feel and touch and taste and speak and listen and do it with a scintillating degree of aliveness. Let's face it, too many of us are sleepwalking through life. And I'm not talking about someone suffering from depression, because you have to get medical help with depression. But many of us are just bored with life, because we've allowed ourselves to become bored with life. And too many of us are getting very little out of life because we're putting very little into it. And many of us have sold ourselves too short because we've been too afraid to make changes that could turn our lives around. But when we wake up and begin living with gratitude, or we see every day as a gift from God, or we see every conversation as an opportunity to learn something about ourselves, or we believe that God is with us in a profoundly loving way, not just now and then, but moment by moment in life, our existence begins to radiate life and energy like a flying Chinese lantern in the sky. I believe, like Dr. Congregational writes, that when Jesus said you must be born again, that it was his way of saying you've got to have a spiritual awakening. Or until you do, you don't really know what God is like. And so Rumi talks about waking up. And it may just be one line of his poetry that will speak to you this morning. But don't underestimate that one line. Listen to it. Underline it. Tape it to your bathroom mirror and read it every morning. Because sometimes all it takes is one line to open up the heart. Now, the second category is poems for loving others. And this is one of the most wonderfully maddening things about Rumi's poetry. When he talks about love, you're never quite sure if he's talking about loving God, or loving a friend, or loving a family member, or even if he's talking about an erotic experience with our bodies. But the fact that it's unclear is a part of Rumi's genius. As a mystic, he understood that God is found in all of it. God is a divine source of love. Which is why Rumi understood that one of the most profound spiritual awakenings we'll ever have is when we love another person. And when you think about it, this confirms one of the most important truths of the Christian faith. That if we want to love God, we just need to love our neighbor. And if we're not willing to love our neighbor, how can we say that we love God? Dr. Congregational wrote that it's my observation is that all great spiritual leaders come to understand that loving others is a part of a much larger universal love that is summed up by the word G-O-D. There were several personal relationships that were on his mind when he wrote this sermon this week. And the first is about Carmen and Luisa Gregorio loving their grandbaby that was baptized today. Their love is a part of a larger mystical love. He was thinking about Helena Furl's family last Sunday at their memorial service. They loved her so much, but their love is part of a larger mystical love. And he was thinking about this young couple down here who joined our church this morning. How he married them on New Year's Eve. But that their love is a part of a much larger mystical experience that pulsates through the universe. Where does human love stop? And divine love start? It's a ridiculous question, really. Because all love comes from the one great spiritual source of the divine. And that's what Rumi can help us to understand. He helps us to understand that to love or to be loved is like the divine spirit, kissing our bodies. Yeah, it's a little bit mystical. But religion is supposed to be mystical. And so, in the words of the Beatles, I invite you on Dr. Congregational's behalf this morning to step right up to the magical, mystical tour of his beloved Rumi. Listen, ponder, and don't forget to smile. Let the words move down into your body. And then let's leave this place today more awake to the God that is everywhere and more in love with every single day of our existence. Amen and amen.